This episode of the podcast is being sponsored by Heshi from Borough Park, Lahagdil Torah Ulahadira. If anybody has any comments, questions, or feedback, or to sponsor an episode or to support the show, please email me, seforimchatter@gmail.com. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbanit Chana Henkin, and we'll be discussing the new book that she edited of the collection of her son, Rav Eitam Henkin, and it's just a collection of his articles and things that he wrote, and it's been translated into English. It's entitled Studies in Halakha and Rabbinic History, and it was published by Magid Press. So thank you, Rabbanit Henkin, for joining me.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss a marvelous book, which means the world to me.
Okay, so let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, you hear from my English that although I've had the zechut of living in Eretz Yisrael for most of my life, I grew up in Spring Valley, New York. We made Aliyah 50 years ago, soon after we were married. My husband became the Rav Ezori of Emek Beit Sha'an. We lived in the development town of Beit Sha'an. People used to say, how do they feel about you being an American in Beit Sha'an? I would say they haven't discovered I'm an American. I'm an Ashkenazi, and that's enough of a culture shock. So my husband was Rav of the area, including Kibush Tzim and Moshavim, and originally reaching up to the Golan. I taught high school, Limudei Kodesh. I was very much Rebbitzin. I did what Rebbitzins do. I was involved in mikveh education for women. That was a very, very central concern in my life. When we moved to Yerushalayim, I eventually started a center for women's learning. I'm Baruch Hashem, a mother, a grandmother. That's enough.
Okay, so let's talk about your son Rav Eitam. That's what we're here to discuss. His writings and his book. Now this book, there's been a number of other books and Seforim published from him, but we're talking about mainly this English one now. So let's first talk about him, talk a little bit, give a background, a biography of him, if you will, before we get into his writings.
Okay. He was born in Yerushalayim. He grew up in Zionist schools. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the term, but the Chardal stream, it's Haredi Leumi. There's no parallel to it in the United States. He was his own person even then. He spent a certain amount of time of his schooling at home as a result of mischievous acts that he engaged in. And at that time, I was disappointed as a mother. At this time, I am grateful, deeply grateful to his teachers, because for much of his time, when his rebbes would send him home, the result would be he'd curl up in bed with Seforim, and I can't give them credit for the fact that he was very much of an autodidact, but he was very much of an autodidact. He read everything that his father wrote. He read everything that his father Zaidi, the great Rav Henkin, wrote. He attended. He was in Hesder. He served in the army. He married very young. Baruch Hashem, he married when he was 20 years old. He had 4 children. He continued learning in a kollel for years. For years after he married, he began teaching. Eventually, they settled in a yeshuv in Binyamin. I would say his father was his primary Rav, although he studied as well with Rav Dov Lior. He began publishing articles when he was around 21 years old. Sometime after that, he did a BA at the Open University. I remember he and our daughter-in-law, Nama, Hashem Yikom Dama, and one or two of the children were sitting at our Shabbos table, and he told us, I don't know how old he was, maybe he was around 23. He told us he decided that he was going to do a PhD under Professor David Asaf. And from that, we concluded that, he's probably going to go to college, because we didn't know that at that point. And he did his first 2 degrees at the Open University at night. It means you don't attend classes. You read. That was built according to his midot. You read, you hand in papers, and eventually he was going to. He was planning to, as I said, to do a PhD. He was awarded Israel's top fellowship for a PhD. He was very happy about that, because he realized he was going to be able to sit in a room for 3 years without any worries about Parnassa and write about the Chafetz Chaim. Professor Asaf, when he visited us during Shiva, we didn't know him, said that when Eitam and he began corresponding, he was astounded, because he found a wonderkind who was sitting in Kollel, who without any academic training, who was writing and reasoning like a seasoned scholar. So I would just say the last piece, in order to understand who our son was, I think you have to understand who his father was. My husband had been a graduate student at Columbia. When from one day to the next, he said, my Zaidi is not going to live forever. And he dropped out of graduate school at not a bad university. He sat with his grandfather and learned with his Zaidi for the next 5 years for the morning, and after a little bit of a rest, the afternoon as well. So I think if you want to know how Rav Eitam developed, I think there was a very strong genetic imprint going back to his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather.
So you mentioned how he used to read Seforim, and he obviously was reading all he can get. But how did he first get involved in history and halakha? So we'll get into the book where he had there's a lot of writings on history and different parts of history, which we'll discuss, and also writings on halakha. So how did he get into those 2 things specifically?
No, you have it wrong. He wasn't involved in history. He was involved in rabbinic history. He was familiar with history because he had this way of picking up random information and storing it in his mind. And, like a jigsaw puzzle has hundreds of pieces, or these really big jigsaw puzzles can have more than that. And the pieces look very similar to each other. And on the other hand, if you can figure out how to organize them, you can come up with a picture. Well, his mind just worked that way. He picked up random pieces of information, and there emerged a razor sharp picture. What he was doing was putting halakha into a context. He wasn't involved in history. I mean, I presume if you asked him about Napoleon, so he could discuss Napoleon. And, if you asked him if you wanted to discuss the Renaissance, I presume he would discuss the Renaissance with you. But that was just like pieces of information that were picked up along along the journey. What he wanted to understand is he wanted to see the Gedolim. Halakha was the language in our house. I mean, when he spoke to his father, that they, did you speak English or Hebrew? The answer is they spoke Halakha. And what he wanted to understand is how the Gedolim were actually running their lives. No hagiography, no censorship, but a real picture that lets you understand. I'm thinking as you asked me that question, there's a difference between a Rosh Hashiva and a community Rav. If you put it into Lithuanian context, I don't mean the way we use the word Lithuanian in Israel today as, are you Hasidim or you Litaim? That's not what I mean. I mean, if you go back to the communities in Lithuania, if you look at the Aruch HaShulchan versus the Mishnah Berurah, the Aruch HaShulchan was the Rav of a community, whereas the Chafetz Chaim was a Rosh Hashiva. In our family, this goes back to Rav Henkin. Rav Henkin Zatzal, when he was in Russia, he moved from one community to another because the authorities would never let him stay in one place for more than a year. So he spent a certain amount of time as a Rosh Hashiva, but he was essentially a Rav of a community, and that's the tradition in our family. And so questions have a context, and I think that's what our son wanted to get at. What's the context for everything that I'm learning?
Yeah, and then you mentioned Rav Henkin, of Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, and there's a lengthy article in him and his history in this book that was translated into English. Now, but the interesting thing about rabbinic history, like you say, that your son Rav Eitam was interested in, what's interesting is how diverse it is. So there's an article about the Marami Rotenberg, and there's in others, I think in other journals he's published other things in the Balei Tosfos, and then you find him involved with there's articles in here on the Musar movement, and then there's a whole book been published from him on the Aruch HaShulchan. He was into Mishnah Berurah, so Chafetz Chaim. So how just interestingly, usually you find people into history, rabbinic history even, right? And they're into one time period. He was from the Balei Tosfos all the way until later on. I mean, why was that? What was the reason for that?
Someone once said to me, I think this was during his lifetime, he said, your son, the one who wrote the Sefer about bugs, the one who's, his field is bugs. And I laughed because you could equally well say the same thing about Shabbos. You could say the same thing about Eruvin. I'll tell you a story. It's a story with a certain amount of punch. After Shiva, wait a minute, I'm going to take a drink of water. So this. After Shiva, we finished, both families started Shiva in our own homes. And then we finished Shiva together in the couple's home. And after Shiva, my youngest daughter took our son's computer to her house. And when they got home, she and her husband plugged in the computer and turned it on, and they needed a code. And they didn't know the code. And thanks to an adolescent prank, they figured out the code. This very much tells who our son was. And he and a friend, I don't know how old they were. Were they 14 years old? I have no idea. They painted the gematria of their names on a big sheet in big letters. They painted numbers. They painted the gematria on their home, and then they scaled the tallest structure in our neighborhood, which it's over 12 stories high. It's a water tower. You see it from all over. It was originally built as a how do you say it in English? Musver. It was built by the army to look like a water tower. It was a water tower, but it was intended as a lookout point to see the Jordanians on Nebi Samuel. Anyway, it was very tall. They scaled this structure. They hung up the gematria of their names. Of course, my son's parents had no idea of what those numbers up there meant and who hung it up there. And my kids knew, but our kids never told us. So my daughter called up her brother, and they discussed this together, and they both said the code has to be that gematria. And thanks to that code, they were able to get into the computer. I'll tell you what we found there. We found a wealth of Torah, only a part of which has been published, including chidushim on 4 simanim of Shulchan Aruch. I'm talking about chidushim included in Even HaEzer. You tell me where he's coming from. I don't know. I said there's a genetic imprint. He was interested in anything and everything. What characterizes this new Sefer, Studies in Halakha and Rabbinic History, is it's all over the place, and every single piece is a masterpiece. That's just the way his mind worked. When he learned anything, he was organized. He was deeply organized. My husband was once with his Zaidi when someone praised Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank Zecher Tzadik Livracha and said he's organized. And my husband Zaidi Zatzal said if he wasn't organized, he wouldn't have been a Gaon. Our son was deeply organized. Everything was there on the computer. In fact, he had a fellowship somewhere, and people commented that he always had his computer. He was listening with one ear, and he was involved in Torah with the other ear. And somehow he managed to speak up coherently and with words worthy of listening to. His father was like that also, except it wasn't with the computer. His father, when he was in school, always had 2 books. He had his school book, and underneath he had whatever he was really dealing with. So our son, Rav Eitam, was organized, and whenever he read anything, his mind was at work. He asked questions, and you could never figure out what side he was going to take. You couldn't anticipate that. But when he learned through anything, the mind was working and the questions were there, and he would go back to things, and that's that from there articles that he published developed. By the time the couple were murdered, he had written 3 books. 2 of them were published in his lifetime. One was published very shortly afterwards. He had thankfully seen the galleys. That was his Sefer, which is called the Eish Tamid on Hilchot Shabbat. And about a year afterwards, we were able to publish his Sefer on which is a historical work on Aruch HaShulchan. The others were halachic works. That's, That's what I can say. When you read in this book the chapter on Bruria, you see he debunks the feminists because who think Chazal think that the feminists who think that Chazal shot down Bruria because she was too smart. Then you read the article, the chapter on historical revisionism on the part of Rav Kook's Talmidim, and you say, he's criticizing the Haredim. Then you read the next chapter on the disappearance of Rav Arieli, and you say, wait a minute, he's criticizing the Tzionim. And then it suddenly hits you. He's not accommodating his writing to an agenda. He's refusing to distort the truth, and then you become mesmerized by the story.
And that so one other thing about him before we will talk a little bit more about the book. You just mentioned some of these fascinating articles. Another thing was that he wrote in such a wide variety of places. So even while he was alive, he wrote. You saw his articles were in. Many listeners are probably familiar with the journal Yeshurun, and then there's the Yeki, the journal Yerushalayim where he wrote it, and then Chitza Gibarim, which is from Lakewood, published from Lakewood. Then he also was writing in Hamayan, which is from Shalavim Yeshiva, and it was other journals that I'm forgetting. And then he was working together with he was working with Rav Daniel Usher Kleiman on. We could talk about that on Gvuras Eliyahu, that Orach Chaim and Yerdei came out from Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, his writing. So he was kind of in like both worlds. It was like it's a very unique thing.
It's even wider than that. There was an article that my husband was probably aware of this. I wasn't. There was an article, or a couple of articles that appeared in Beis Aaron B'Yisrael of Karlin Stolin. And on the other hand, I don't know if any of your listeners are familiar with this, because this is Israeli, it's in Hebrew, but he published in Tchumin. He published in Akdamot. Tchumin is the journal of Tzomet in Israel. These come from the world of Hesder. He also published in Tzion, which is an academic journal, a highly prestigious academic journal of the Israel Historical Society. The amazing thing is that wherever that his writings were accepted in all these places, because he because he was honest, he wrote with unswerving integrity. And people showed me things in Shiva that I hadn't known. Apparently he wrote in Yiddish. He needed to learn a second language for his MA. So what was he going to learn? He was going to learn French or something. I don't know. So he learned Yiddish. That's what I meant before when I said he was basically sitting in the Torah world. The academic world was for him a tool. It was an important tool, but it was a tool. So he had the opportunity, he needed to learn a language. He learned Yiddish. Someone showed me Ivil, which I'm not familiar with. And after the murder, the shock there, and the description is, I don't remember the terms they use. He's Gavaldig or something, who was one of the Chavura. So I think that I don't know anyone of his generation who had so broad an exposure. My own feeling is because he was a part of all of those worlds, that there was a part of him that was part of all of those worlds.
Yeah, he definitely was, like we said, very, very unique in this regard, in many regards. So let's talk about this new Sefer, this new book that you just published. So you mentioned before that bugs was a big thing. And that's the first article in the book is what you permitted, we prohibited, the kosher status of strawberries. I mean, this comes from, I think it's from his Hebrew Sefer, right? Lachem Yul Achli, as a whole Sefer about bugs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe you want to talk about this, and he says there's other things in here. He talks about the waiting in between the different 5-6 hours in between milchiks and fleishes. He talks about, so why was these different? First the bugs part, but then the other different halachic matters. I mean, I don't know if you have to talk about that article and the sefer of his that he wrote. Why was it he read a whole sefer dedicated to something like this?
Listen, I'm outside of my own comfort zone. I'll try to answer that question the best I can. He had nothing against chumrah, as long as you know the difference between halakha and a chumrah. And he felt very strongly that the proliferation of technological institutes were pushing we're pushing, we're stretching motchim et gvulot michutz lahalacha, me'ever lahalacha. He felt that they were stretching the lines beyond halacha. So you have, if you read that first article, as I said, this is not my field of expertise. It's not something which I should properly be discussing, but I'll read you. I'll read you a paragraph. One who is scrupulous about observance, the Hebrew would be makpid, may ask, so what? Why not avoid chickpeas? He's talking about a heter that Maharshak, Rav Shlomo Kluger, gave, and it was brought by Rav Elyashiv. I'll give you the background to the paragraph. I'll read an earlier paragraph. It was brought by Rav Elyashiv and by Rav Mordechai Brisk, who wrote, "This Gaon Zatzal, Maharshak, is himself worthy of being relied upon, even when circumstances are not pressing. In other words, even when it's not Shat HaTachat. Maharshak permitted whole chickpeas when there was a substantial minority. For readers who are translating back into Hebrew, that's a miut hamatzoi, which were infested by maggots with no external sign of infestation on several grounds. And he added that even if general, one should not rely on these rationales only b'diavad. Nevertheless, in this case, there'd be no other way to eat chickpeas. Now I'm going to skip and read another paragraph. One who's scrupulous about observance may ask, so what? Why not avoid chickpeas? They're certainly not a staple food. Moreover, why did Maharshak define this as prohibiting the entire species? They could have made the effort to cut each pea in half and inspect it for infestation. And if it was not infested, they could eat it. This person would also have to ask why the Ramah writes in Yoredei Tzadivav at the end that in a place where the only radishes in the market were cut with knives of non-Jews, one may purchase them and rely on the view that permits them b'diavad after removing the place of the cut. Why couldn't they simply refrain from eating radishes? There's no existential need to eat radishes, so why not follow Ikar Hadin, the basic halacha, and say lechatchila, the entire radish is forbidden. After posing that question, you get to what our son was about. There's tremendous yirat shamayim here. There's tremendous understanding of the halacha, and he says it surely is a great act of piety and asceticism to refrain from eating anything questionable, even after inspection. However, it's clear that such practice is not the black letter law, and should not be applied to the public. And it's enough that we found a reasonable explanation for the practice of the disciples of prophets, B'nai Nevi'im, in other words, Am Yisrael. So if you read the paragraph, read the chapter carefully, you'll see that what he's distressed about is passing off a chumrah as the halacha and then demanding it of everybody. And his feeling is that it's inappropriate to stretch the boundaries of halacha beyond halacha. His feeling was that the institutes which were doing the testing weren't publishing their results fully in such a way that a posek could look at the results and could paskin according to halacha, and halacha doesn't demand 0% infestation. The rest is there for you to read, and I hope I haven't made mincemeat of a chapter. If I have, forgive me, it's not the chapter, it's my description.
Now let's talk about a chapter that you translated, because we'll talk later about different translators, but chapter 6, the history of washing before Kiddush, which comes from his Sefer Eish Tamid translation. Okay. That's an interesting discussion there as well. He talks about the history of today, everyone, people may be familiar that Yekis, so to speak, wash before Kiddush. But
Yekis and the Henkins. It's not a Yekish minhag. It's minhag harama. The Rashba says the Rashba was like the 12th century. He says he never saw anyone who didn't wash up before Kiddush. It's not even just the Ashkenazi. Rashba is in Spain.
Yeah, no, and that's what the article, he talks about the history and he goes through that. It's a really interesting an article. So, and then
it's an amazing thing because until you get to the 19th century, it is normative to wash up before Kiddush. It's the Ramah cites this as the minhag pashut as in widespread.
Yeah. So now flipping through the net,
it's not the Beit Yosef's minhag; it's the Ramah's minhag.
Right. Now the next part, so part 2 is studies in rabbinic history. So I'll just flip through. Maybe you'll see what you want to talk about, just to give the listeners a sense of what's in the book. There's a chapter on Tu B'Av and the dances and the festival as it's ready.
I'm just going to interrupt you. What that chapter is about is that Chazal say there weren't joyous days like Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur when the unmarried girls would go out and dance in the vineyards. And what our son asks is, what were they doing dancing in the vineyards on Yom Kippur? He brings, this is one of the earliest articles that he wrote. He must have been around 21 at the time. He wants to know, it doesn't make sense that they were dancing in the vineyards. Tu B'Av, okay, but dancing in the vineyards as a way of marriages coming about doesn't match what Yom Kippur is about. And so he brings all of the explanations of why they were dancing in the vineyards on Yom Kippur. And then he goes and he shows that they weren't dancing in the vineyards on Yom Kippur. They were dancing in the vineyards on Tu B'Av. And suddenly the whole thing makes sense. Oh, I see. On Yom Kippur, they were doing what they're supposed to do on Yom Kippur.
The next chapter you already mentioned, I don't know if you want to talk about it more, where he goes through the whole the Bruria story in Gemara and Avodah Zarah. So that's something I'm sure many listeners are probably interested in reading about. He talks about Rabbi Akiva. There's another article on Rabbi Akiva. And then, like I mentioned earlier, he also has, there's other articles in Hebrew where he talks about the Bali Taisis, but in here there's an article reassessing the imprisonment of Rami Rotenberg and his ransom for burial. Famous story that many are familiar with. So that's something that he talks about. And then it jumps forward. There's a chapter on the Musar controversy. There's a chapter on the Musar Yeshiva Navardik. Then there's the Aruch HaShulchan, and these. I think these articles are taken from the Aruch HaShulchan book that was published in completely in Hebrew, right?
Two chapters are taken from the Aruch HaShulchan book. Yeah.
Right, and that book is in Hebrew, which I guess once I will mention here. Obviously, there'll be a link in the show's notes to purchase this book. I'll put a link also for the Aruch HaShulchan book. That's also available. That one's in Hebrew. We'll mention the Aruch HaShulchan book is only in Hebrew, but this is in English. But I'll put it also in the show's notes as well.
I'm going to give a plug for another book, which in Yirtzeh Hashem will be appearing, I think, next week. We're waiting for it. We're waiting for it to appear. It's an expanded version of Lachem Yiyeh Le'ochla, published now by Mossad Harav Kook in Israel, and it's expanded because of additional material we found on the computer. So I'm just mentioning that starting next week in Yirtzeh Hashem, it'll be available via Mossad Harav Kook, and the booksellers if there are any booksellers who are listening in the United States, they'll be able to import it.
Okay, so if that's up, when I post the podcast episode, if that is available, I'll put a link to that, and if not, people, whenever anyone is listening to this in the future, hopefully it's available and they'll be able to check that out. So again, there's many more articles in here that I can mention. I don't know if you wanted to talk about any of those ones that I mentioned over there. Is there any more that you want to say about these? He also has zealotry versus tolerance in the old Yishuv. He talks about the relevant now, the Shemitah controversy, myths and facts. So he has a whole lengthy article on Shemitah, more food for thought. There's another article on Shemitah.
I'll read you something since you mentioned Shemitah. I'll read you one paragraph, which we put on the book jacket. He writes this. The reader might ask himself, what's the upshot of all this? For or against the Heter Mechira? That question is irrelevant to this discussion. The personal opinion of this writer as a matter of public halachic policy matters not a whit. Now, I'm inserting parenthetically, he certainly had an opinion, but he's writing about his own opinion, that it's irrelevant. The message here, as with the previous articles that I wrote on this topic, is different. One must clarify the facts honestly to the fullest possible extent and be careful not to misrepresent them one way or another, consciously or otherwise, in order to buttress the desired outcome. This is what's occurred, sadly, in a great many of the materials that have been written and continue to be written on the topic of Shemitah. The real world tends by nature to be nuanced, for which reason the tendency to describe historical data as if they all, from beginning to end, support a specific contemporary position is a far cry from the pursuit of truth. Another famous passage that he actually wrote, it's not published, it's something that made its way around the internet after the murder, was the correspondence that he had with Rabbanit Chana in Israel, in which he's the person who runs Otzar HaChachma, and he wrote to Rav Blitzky. We all know that when after a person's 120, when he comes before Beis Din Shalala, he'll be asked, Nasata v'natata be'emunah, were you honest in your business dealings? Did you set aside times to learn Torah? And what party did you vote for? I mean, that's him. What you're going to find in this whole book is something which is highly original, with impeccable scholarship, with a tremendous range of knowledge, and which is not distorted in order to match one ideology or another. That doesn't mean that my son didn't have his own outlook. He certainly did. But he, I mean, that may have to do, it may have to do with the fact that he was a Henkin. He had a very strong identification via his great-grandfather with the Litvish communities, and on the other hand, he wore kippahs through that. You asked about the chapters in the book. Here, you take it to wherever you want to take it.
No, if there's anything else I will just mention, I just wanted to list off for the listeners, and you can mention any other ones if you want. There's also a bunch of chapters on Rav Kook, and you mentioned the disappearance of Rav Yitzchak Arieli, and then the last two chapters in the book are about his great-grandfather, right, Rav Yosef Leo Henkin, from New York. So there's his background. So talk about that's as well, the last two, yeah. So and yeah, it's over 400 pages. There's a lot of material in here. That was published. So, any of the specific articles that you wanted to mention at all? Any other ones to the listeners?
I'm a teacher, and sometimes the girls I teach ask me, so who's your favorite, Rashi or Ramban? And my answer is, when I teach Rashi, the answer is Rashi. When I teach Ramban, the answer is Ramban. When I'm editing the Musar controversy, then it's the Musar controversy. And when I'm editing the article about Rav Henkin and Rav Goren, then it's that. I can't say that. I can't say that I have a favorite article. I can say that I've learned a tremendous amount from each article. The story of this book is very interesting. I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm telling you a different story, and it has to do with the book. We didn't think of translating his articles into English. Never would have occurred to us. I think after the Shloshim, we were phoned by a rabbi in the United States, someone whom we didn't know, and he asked our permission to organize translators, volunteer translators, to translate the book. I'm sorry, to translate the articles. He explained to us that there were people in the United States who were followers of our son's writing, and that they felt very strongly that they wanted to make the book. They wanted to make a book of his articles in English. The person who called us was Rabbi Moshe Rosenberg, rabbi in Queens, someone I don't know. And my husband said, yeah, go ahead and translate. The job turned out to be much harder than anyone bargained for, because in any one of his articles, my son wrote 2 articles. There was the article and there were the footnotes, and the footnotes were a killer. He had very strict rules for himself of what goes in the article and what goes in the footnotes. And the footnotes are fascinating, and they give you so much history that you never would have known. So if someone looks at an article and says it's 15 pages, I can do that. But they don't take into account that the footnotes are written in small print, and sometimes the footnotes are as long as the article. So we owe a great debt to the original translators, and I once we received their articles, I hope the translators will forgive me. I took liberty. I read through the Hebrew line by line with the translation, and there was a sterling quill in Hebrew, and I I tried my best that the same should be in English. And my husband, Zichrono Livracha, was still alive during much of the translation, and I would ask him. He was ill at the time, but I would ask him. I would read him a sentence and ask him what he thought, and the ease with language ran in the family. I'm looking at the table of contents. I mean, the articles on historical revisionism are fascinating. Both sides of the story, the Haredi side of the story, the national religious side of the story, what happened to Jewish life and how the current streams emerge. And we sometimes think it was always the way it is today, and it wasn't always the way it is today. Those are amongst my favorites. I don't know. They're the
Let me ask you one more thing.
Article on strawberries is also a.
Let me ask you. Let me jump in and ask you one more thing about. You mentioned the translation. So first of all, I want to mention also. I don't know if you mentioned Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brot was, I know, involved with this, and he was involved with the Aruch HaShulchan book as well, right, with editing it.
Oh yes. We never would have been able to do it without him. After my daughter was able to open up the computer, we made copies. One of my sons then took the hard drive and removed all the personal parts of it, and we then gave over the hard drive to two people. One of them was my son, who organized and made a list of what's on the hard drive, and also a friend, Rav Oz Blumen, also looked over the hard drive to see what was there. A friend of our families sat with us. A lot of people came to visit us, not just during the Shiva, of course. Then it was in the thousands, but afterwards sat with us, and we spoke about what we were looking to do. And a friend of ours said, "You're going to drown. You're never going to be able to handle the volume that's there. You need help." And this came from two directions at the same time. They both pointed to Rabbi Eliezer Brot, and we had conversations with him. A friend of ours enabled him to be part of this project, and we had conversations, and still do, many times a day. And we're talking about the next Sefer, and we're debating what the next Sefer should be. The next Sefer is going to be in Hebrew. It's if Rav Eliezer has his way, the next Sefer is going to be about Rav Henkin, our son, the great posek. Our son collected a tremendous amount of information about his Alter Zaidi, and if I have my way, the next book is going to be an anthology, which is about three figures, not one, very different from each other. One of them will be Rav David Karliner, Rav David Friedman of Karlin. The other will be Rav Henkin, by age, Rav Kook, and the third will be Rav Henkin. So we'll see who wins this battle. I don't know. Rav Brat says to me, you can't do that because there's too much information about each one, and there needs to be a monograph about each one, and I want to see the three together. We'll see. There's also what we're going to publish. We have to figure out what we do with the halacha that we have. My husband was in favor of publishing the chidushim on Shulchan Aruch, but we have to look it over. I don't know if there's enough to make up a book.
And one more thing about, you mentioned Rav Henkin, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin. So I know he was, your son Rav Eitam was very involved with Rav Daniel Asher Kleinman in editing, and they put out Orach Chaim and Yeridea of Gvuras Eliyahu. So do you know, I mean, did your son Rav Eitam, did he work more on Choshen Mishpat Even Ezer, or was not, will those be published? I don't know if you know.
No, what they were doing together, let's go back a little before that. Rav Daniel Kleinman sat with Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky, and he heard many references to Rav Henkin, and he said, but no one knows who Rav Henkin is. Where are his writings? And the answer is Rav Henkin was too busy with Ezra's Torah. Not just that, he didn't keep carbon copies of the thousands of Shiloh that he answered. So there wasn't a written legacy. There was a small written legacy, but not a large written legacy that encompassed the enormous volume of questions he was asked. So Rev Kleinman decided on his own, with no connection with the family, that he was going to collect and publish Tshuvot of Rav Henkin. He started doing that, and he discovered that there's a great-grandson in Israel that he should speak to. And the two met. Rav Kleinman had lived for a period of years in Eretz Israel, so they spoke together in Hebrew. My son understood English, but and in fact, he went to Poland once to lecture at an academic conference, and he lectured in English, and he thought he was concerned about that. He thought it was very funny that he was going to speak in English. But the two of them spoke together in Hebrew, and they were collecting, each one in his own way, whatever they could find of Rav Henkin's writings, but mostly they spent time on the phone together, sometimes every day, trying to decipher and understand what Rav Henkin wrote, because he wrote tersely, and Rav Eitam was a master at deciphering. I mean, I think he worked somewhat like my husband, which is that you have something in front of you, so you go look and you leave nothing unturned. And my son had one up on my husband that he used the computer to access things in addition to using the library. But we have a very good library at home, and that's what Rav Eitam grew up on, and so that's what he was doing together with Rav Kleinman. Basically, they worked together and they fit the pieces of the puzzle together. They figured things out together. And you have to ask Rav Kleinman what the division of labor was, because I'm not sure. I know there's a lot of discussion together, and it was a labor of love on my son's part. I thought it was a tremendous privilege.
Right. Okay. So those two volumes are just Seforim and the Seforim store and Orach Chaim Yeridea, and like mentioned in
Well,
this book.
hopefully, over the course of time, the additional volumes on Evan Hazer and Choshen Mishpat will emerge. But for Rav Kleinman, it was a tremendous blow because the two of them were working together, and now suddenly he was left with working alone. He showed up at our shiva. It was very emotional. Um, he came, he sat down. There were always so many people in the room. We didn't recognize people. My husband had met him before. I hadn't met him. So I turned to him and I asked him who he was. And he told us. And we were shocked that he had made the trip to Eretz Yisrael for the Shiva. Excuse me. And he said, I lost a brother. So the two of them were very close and worked very, very closely together. But I would also add, it's very interesting. There were a lot of people who consulted our son. This included professors. And I once stressed history was rabbinic history, and it was totally secondary to sitting and learning halakha. And those who understood his gifts predicted that he was going to be a first-ranked posek. But there's a paragraph here that I'd like to read to you as we're ending our conversation. This had to do with I included this in my preface. I'll read you the paragraph. One characteristic illustration of our son's generosity of spirit was in correspondence shown to me by Rav Moshe David Chechik, a Ben Gurion University professor who had headed 2 departments at the university, was amongst the scores of scholars in touch with our son. This professor heard through the grapevine that our son was collecting documents relating to Maharil Diskin, and he asked to see something. So our son responded, and this is a quote that was shown to me. Truth be told, I felt more than a twinge when I received your request. The topic itself, the tension between traditionalism and modernity in Orthodox leaders, in particular those considered as zealots, is of much interest to me. And I have for several years been collecting material on the topic, though not methodically, and I've been planning to use this material for a full-scale article. You have here, I'll continue in a moment, but I'm just interpolating. This really was of interest, the tension between traditionalism and modernity in Talmidei Chachamim. Okay, now I go back. After he writes that he's been collecting material for several years. However, I don't find much benefit in kinat sofrim, academic jealousy. And as you are ahead of me and have already begun to write, the academic world will certainly benefit from your work, as with your previous work. Therefore, I will be happy to send you the materials in my possession. And then he adds that the professor doesn't need my bibliographical assistance, but I'm appending a list of primary sources that had landed in my fishing net with good wishes to you for an excellent article.
Wow, amazing. So just one last question here and like I said, I'll put the link in the show's notes. People can purchase the book. Obviously, this book will show you, your son Rav Eitam's his talent and all his knowledge. But besides that we discussed, but besides for that, I mean, who would you say someone, not why should someone, besides for those reasons, what else can someone gain from the book? They should pick up the book to read.
Well, it's fascinating. It's a masterpiece. It's wonderful Shabbos afternoon reading. I know that the book on Aruch HaShulchan here in Israel, it was sold out during the first week of its printing. They printed 2,000 copies, and by the end of 1 week, it was already it was already off the shelves. Why do I think people should read it? For the same reasons. It's unique. It's rare to find someone who's accepted by all the world. You're modern Orthodox, you can read this book and you can say, wow. You're Haredi, you read this book and you say, wow. It's a bestseller. Someone once said to me about two of my children, they have the way of turning the way they write, they turn the most boring subjects into fascinating books that you can't put down. So I guess that's the reason you and some of these chapters are done it, but there's kedusha to this also. It's fascinating reading.
Yeah, some real like fascinating topics, and he was obviously a really fascinating and extremely knowledgeable person, and hopefully that comes through in the book. And we look forward to further writings and books and things coming out from him that you'll be publishing. And thank you for joining me to discuss him and the book.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.